Welcome to Left, East to West with me, Nikki Hill.
And me, Tom Parkin. And Nikki, do you think this Mark Carney plan to sell off the airports and ports is really going to happen?
Oh, jumping right into it today.
Yeah.
It's a surprise, but also a surprise in 2016 when the then finance minister Bill Morneau proposed the same thing.
Yeah.
So, and then Justin Trudeau had to read the backlash. So I think you're going to watch that public support and public response to
Mm,
it. Morneau ended up backing off and quit, complaining about the prime minister's office. So we'll see
yeah.
where we go next on this adventure.
Yeah. Although this time maybe it's being driven by the PM himself. I mean, it kind of sounds like his signature rather than the finance minister. And then, where's Mr. Polyev? Is he going to oppose this thing? Anyway, this is all kind of an interesting discussion at a time when the idea of public option and affordability is back on the table in Canada. Something we're going to talk about in our interview with political scientist Dave McGrane.
We are indeed, largely because Dave is the University of Saskatchewan professor who does a podcast series for the Broadbent Institute, which is focusing on biographies of early social democrats. And a lot of that is the histories of people building movements that wrested power from old elites to get a better deal for Canadians. And these are also people who looked at investments and nationalization of programs, looking at better public options. And sometimes that meant rewiring how our economy works. But before we get today, we're going to get to this week below the fold, taking a look at a couple of important stories that maybe didn't make national headlines this week. Pharmacare is a public option that uses single public buying power to shave billions off of drug prices, but it hasn't been in the national headlines for a long time. Tom, tell us why it surfaced again this week in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah. Well, Tony Wakeham is the relatively new premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. The PC leader was sworn into office last fall. And his last week, his health minister made a very public expression of concern about the Carney government that they were not treating her province fairly, refusing to come to the table and negotiate entry into the National Pharmacare Plan, which is something they wanted to join. In
Mhm.
Minister Evans' words, Newfoundland and Labrador was excluded from pharmacare. The door was closed by Mr. Carney. Now, folks will remember that so the Liberals promised national pharmacare for years and years. Nothing happened until their 2021 minority, when then NDP leader Jagmeet Singh pushed them into it. Don Davies then stick-handled implementation talks with the Liberals, and legislation became law in late 2024, October. And then just after that, in the next few months, the Trudeau government negotiated deals with BC, Manitoba, PEI, and Yukon, providing federal funds to cover diabetes medication, birth control, and the BC and Manitoba plans also cover menopausal hormone replacement therapy. And we've talked about that in your experience with that program in BC, Nikki. Yeah, something
Yeah,
you've
it's
used.
popular. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I think also, it's funny how you talk about it everywhere now because now that it's free, women are talking about it, which is
right.
always half the battle on these issues. I would spend probably an hour at the spa the other night talking about it with everyone there. So it's a big topic. Residents want it.
Yeah, and those coverages for those items, the diabetes, birth control, and HRT, was supposed to be just the initial step towards a bigger program,
Hmm.
which would use global public bulk buying power to force pharmaceutical companies to shave billions off their prices. Of course, Big Pharma didn't like that. Drug insurance carriers also not big fans of taking a haircut for the benefit of Canadians. And that larger vision really appears nowhere in the agenda of the Carney government. But the thing that our friends from Newfoundland and Labrador were concerned about is that even that initial step, the door was closed to them in having this discussion. Uh,
Hmm.
this is kind of an interesting story because it's being driven in an interesting way by Newfoundland and Labrador NDP leader Jim Dinn, who spent a lot of his question period time keeping this story alive. Like, why are we not joining? There's
Yeah.
other provinces are doing it. So he'd used a lot of question period time asking why the province wasn't taking up the federal cash for a pharmacare program. At that time, before Wakeham, it was Liberal Premier Fury, and he had
Hmm.
kind of like just not given non-answers really about why he wasn't proceeding, but uh, suspicion would be that he didn't want to proceed because he knew that Carney really didn't want to proceed either, and he didn't want to
Uh,
say all those kind of things out loud, so he mumbled them instead. But then the Liberals got swept out, and Wakeham, a Conservative, is in as of last October, and he started saying to the federal government, um, "Let's get to the table and start building this program for us." Back in mid-November, uh, a reporter directly asked Mark Carney about whether his government was open to expanding the existing coverage plan to other provinces because he really hadn't said much, and his minister of health was being very closed mouthed about it.
yeah.
And Carney said, "Yeah, my government it does want to expand coverage to what he called the outstanding provinces." So he won, you know,
Right.
that's what he
Yeah.
said. But that was then, that was November, and this is now May. And according to Wakeham, in the last 6 months, he's twice written to the federal minister of health and twice
Hmm.
directly spoken to Mark Carney about starting talks to, get the pharmacare deal, this national program that is supposed to be available. And the Carney government has not named anyone for him to have these talks with. So the door is closed, as the minister says.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think this is an interesting story in itself, but there's kind of an interesting dynamic that I also find valuable. Uh, in Canadian politics, there's often a general strategy for building federal political strength that's always worked well. Identifying issues, a federal leader identifying issues where provincial governments or provincial parties need Ottawa to push some
Yeah.
federal policy lever, but aren't getting the help. And then being their advocate, being their ally, and trying to put the pressure on to get a win. It certainly
Yeah.
will get a national leader into provincial headlines. It shows they're listening, shows they're relevant, and you get to have conversations with people in different parts of the country in a joint project, which you can establish relationships that are handy down the road. So, in thinking about this and thinking about how important really pharmacare is. I mean, it's good politics and good policy, perhaps, for Avi Lewis to reach out to Jim Dinn and Tony Wakeham,
Hmm.
and offer his help to make Mark Carney live up to his words on pharmacare. That pressure might force
Hmm.
Carney to live up to his words. It show the value of the federal NDP, and hopefully, get the good people of Newfoundland and Labrador some farm care coverage like you folks have in
Hmm.
BC and they have in Manitoba too. So
Manitoba.
that would
Yeah.
be a win.
Yeah, and there's like an interesting equity issue that I would imagine is going to emerge here because and we were talking to Claudia
Mhm.
Tender about this a few weeks ago. It's like a couple provinces have it. It's not just, we celebrate the HRT on this show because of women of a certain age, but
Right.
contraception, diabetes medication, all these things that are life changing medications that people need access to and now are being inequitably available across the country because some provinces went down this path with the feds. So I think it's huge. So I think it might become a bigger issue in the future.
Mhm. Mhm. And, the labor movement put a lot of time and effort into pushing for this for many years. So
Mhm.
that's,
Yeah,
I'm assuming, still there, latent, ready to get retapped
yeah,
by whoever wants to pick up the ball and push it forward.
yeah.
I thought, you I thought, culture war conservatives hated global institutions, Nikki. That was always
Mm,
like, just from following the mega, theatrics, that they hated global institutions, especially the ones that tell people what to do, and that I would have thought they would really hate mandatory genetic testing, but apparently some of the BC Conservative leaderships, candidates, really love the idea. What's that all about?
yeah, it's so interesting. I think this will probably be the last episode for now that we talk about the BC Conservative leadership race, although it bundles up into a global issue that's been bugging me lately.
Yeah.
Because until we get at least past the May 30th deadline, because for their vote and find out who their leader is, because now they're into that stage where, like we talked about last week, the different phases, but also policy development time and platform release time for candidates. There have been a couple of debates since our last episode with the full candidate slate, which hadn't happened yet. And we are really seeing where divisions and differences in opinion are aligning up
Mhm,
here in
mhm,
the last five solidified slate here. But there's a thread here to a global issue that, like I said, it's been like a little bit of a puzzle for me. And I think, you're right, Tom. When I talk, I have friends who are, maybe traditional conservatives, wouldn't classify themselves as like the new right conservatives, but are, also asking these questions about why there are this conservative in Canada and BC debate about policy issues, which really do come into the bedroom or really would be impactful on people's personal lives in a way conservatives haven't looked at those
mhm,
types of issues in the past. So we are seeing an interesting dynamic, though, that's emerging, and BC having a leadership race for a conservative party is seeing some maybe what we call above the fold dynamics happening, editorials, more debate about if it's whether it's important for conservatives right now to continue to focus on the so-called culture war,
mhm,
and or if they should be moving into the issues that the public, when we look at polls, say are most important to them, like the economy, healthcare,
right,
housing. And so there's an interesting debate publicly going on between conservatives themselves about digging in on maintaining this culture war concept, and we're seeing this in the BC leadership debate too,
mhm,
but some growing distinctions on candidates. Um, and so we also saw sort of on that vein of trying to, look at other issues and what's important to the public. We've got some policy positions coming up from different BC Conservative leadership candidates. In the past week, we saw a platform released by candidate Ian Black. He called it his 5-point premiers plan. So it was really more centered on some of those things the public saying
mhm,
that they're prioritizing. So that healthcare job affordability, although it does have a plank on social engineering, which is
mhm,
speaking to the base of the party that is probably making a couple of these candidates lean into culture war issues. I think sometimes in our below the fold, we're talking about things that are like, what are progressives missing about what's going on the right and what attracts voters to the right?
mhm,
And so, my question here is also, maybe twofold before we dive into the issue at hand, which is also why is the culture war even a feature in a competitive race? And maybe we'll probably keep seeing more of that because it's certainly been in the public discourse of conservatives debating each other nationally right now. But I want to dip into one plank that is actually being pushed by a couple of candidates in this race, and not just here in BC, but it ties into the recent International Olympic Committee's ruling that eligibility for any female category event at the Olympic Games or any other IOC event, including individual and team sports, is now limited to biological females determined on the basis of a one-time SRY gene screening. So back to
mhm,
that testing we started with here,
mhm,
Tom. So I just want to be really clear for listeners because I think we see sort of the culture war framing of this. But what this means is it's a new role for anyone who wants to compete as a female athlete in those categories. So this is going to apply to the LA Olympic Games in 2028 and beyond. Despite the evidence, we've had any clear evidence here that we had transgender women poised to participate in these games. But what we're now seeing is a plan for more intrusive scrutiny of women's bodies. It's going to be in place for sports. So we, again, beyond the BC Conservatives race here, we had a policy that's been really pushed heavily
mhm,
by the US and particularly Donald Trump.
mhm,
Last year, Alberta passed Bill 29 to ban transgender athletes from competing in female amateur sports. And so, there are additional threads here beyond our borders here in BC. This is one of those issues that is being raised by others across the country. Again, we're not seeing evidence of why it needs to be addressed. And I do think, women and many men would feel pretty safe saying that anytime Donald Trump pushes a policy that relates to women's bodies, it's probably a bad sign when it's especially being framed as protecting women.
mhm,
So, what's also important, I think, is this isn't new to BC Conservatives. Their former leader, just in 2024, John Rustad, brought forward a bill to legislature which didn't make it past first reading because it was ruled discriminatory. And it did propose to use biological sex to classify participants in publicly funded sports teams and events, effectively banning transgender athletes. So, a couple candidates here. We got Erie Fulmer has a commitment to protect women-only spaces and girls and women's sport. Carolyn Elliott's been
mhm,
really leaning into this, I think, with the debates that they've been having on the contest. framing it in terms of ensuring fairness and safety in women's sports by ensuring biological females are able to compete against other biological females. She was actually interviewed after one of these debates saying she would go as far as to use the notwithstanding clause to
Okay.
ban transgender surgeries for minors and ban biological males from accessing women's spaces.
Okay.
So, we've got lots going on here.
Yeah, Nikki, just
But
help me out here for a second. Like,
yeah,
uh, you know, going to the Olympics, that's a very different thing than being involved in local amateur sport. I mean,
yeah.
just to think of it from that perspective, I mean, how far do they want to intrude, to what level of, involvement, in sport?
Yeah.
I mean, was this just like, if I wanna be in my neighborhood league or something, or if I'm at a university sport?
Yeah, some of these provincial policies, and Alberta certainly is very still focused on amateur
Yeah.
support sport as well, right? Where I think the OIC, and I think the challenge is if you're entering into amateur sport, you may have your eye on professional sport, on the Olympics. But now, if you actually go through your life and you're participating in in the female category, it's something that's world ranking.
Mhm.
No matter what, you now have to undertake that mandatory genetic screening and testing. So just for the
Mm,
sake of being an athlete who's a woman, you don't actually get a pass. Well, they try to put into place this policy around the gene assessments and tests.
mhm.
So, and I think that's a good question, Tom. Like, what are we actually trying to solve for here? Like, why are provincial politicians or leadership candidates been trying to address, amateur sports, women's sports, and places? We're not seeing other mentions of women in these platforms, like
Well,
funding women's sports
yeah, I mean,
or
the IOC also has all kinds of rules about doping and things like that. I mean, it just operates
yeah,
at a completely different level than people who wanna go out and have a little bit of fun,
yeah.
and enjoy themselves doing sport, and now the state is intruding on wants you to do a DNA test? That's seems a bit
Yeah, yeah,
a
and right
bit
now
a
the
bit of a
OIC is up
push.
to the Olympic level, and I think where we're seeing these conservative
Uh-huh.
politicians is just, I don't think identifying how they would ban people
Yeah.
who are trans from participating in women's sports, but you can certainly see where those policies are shaping
Mm,
up. I
mhm.
think one of the other challenges is that when you introduce this concept, and I think what we'll see here and what some of the high concern is you're not just barring transgender women from competition, you're actually targeting other women, and you'll target and disqualify cisgender women who maybe have a different same-sex
Yep,
development, those like tomboys. So we're talking amateur sport, when you're
yep.
putting into question who's allowed to compete, all you're gonna see, I think, are those tomboy kids,
Mm,
right, being
mm,
questioned about their sex, having adults bullying them, being harassed. And one of the things I think that's important here too, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about sport later in the
mhm.
show, is also we just saw the Future of Sport Canada Commission final report, and it actually really focuses in on when it went to the feds, talking about addressing issues like discrimination, safety, and harassment that are keeping people out of entering sports,
Yep.
particularly underrepresented people. So I think, the bottom line here, it's like, why, when we're not seeing evidence of these being issues in local communities, in amateur sports, when the experts in sports are on the opposite thread, which is let's get more people and stop harassment, we're seeing this push on sort of these culture war
Mhm,
issues that are have huge ramifications. So it's women's bodies being policed now by
mm,
conservative
mm,
under
mm,
the auspice, I think, of the culture war and a regressive policy now that's actually going to impact everyone's kids if they wish to participate in professional sports at some point or go to these world rankings. So
mhm,
really fascinating to watch it play out and the why. I think we're still, as I said, not seeing any evidence that even at that OIC level that there were trans women planning to participate in 2028. So, but there's this huge debate and a huge amount of policy change to get ahead of a problem that doesn't seem to address where on the counter, there's so many other issues to address for women and
mm.
girls in sports right now.
It always seems when we get into some of these culture war issues that it's really about conservatives being real busybodies.
Yeah.
And just getting involved in stuff that's none of your damn business.
Which I think
Um,
a lot of traditional conservative voters would
yeah,
agree on. It's certainly what I talk to folks about, and they're like, This isn't my issue. Like, get back to the economy, right?"
yeah,
So I think,
yeah.
but we're seeing that. So there was an Aaron O'Toole debate this week with some of
Mhm,
the younger new right people. So I think this is, one to watch, and for progressives to try to really understand what it is that brings this culture war concept into the public domain so much.
mhm.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break and come back with Dave McGrane.
Sounds good.
Welcome to Left, East to West, Dave McGrane. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Dave, you're a professor of political studies at the University of Saskatoon, a past president of the Saskatchewan NDP, and author of almost 40 books, journal articles, and book chapters, but also importantly, a podcast host, so famous, working with the Broadbent Institute to bring us monthly episodes of Social Democrats in the North, a history of early Social Democrats.
Mm.
And Tom wrote your bio, so he forgot to mention something I'm sure was really formational for you in your career, which was being a former member of the New Democratic Youth of Canada exec with me many moons ago.
That was a
But as
while
I think
ago.
about that, it's probably pushing into 30 years. We're not going to talk about it. Moving
Mm.
on from that. So great to have you on the show. Can you tell us a little bit about the podcast to start and where we can find it?
Well, it's on kind of all major platforms, Apple, all those other ones, and yeah, it's by the Bob Institute. It's really a kind of a deep dive into some of the more foundational figures of Canadian social democracy and history of Canadian social democracy. People that you probably haven't heard about before, but nonetheless played a really important role in defining what Canadian social democracy is today. And it also gives some tips for your activism as you move forward in trying to push Canada in a more social democratic direction.
Yeah,
Great.
it's a really enjoyable series, and yeah, the people I that you're talking about, they're kind of biographical pieces, and the people you talk about, I'm not familiar with, and some, but by and large not. And you trace back in your show that you make the argument that probably the first political social democrat was a guy named Langto, who ran as a Labour candidate in Montreal and organized the first union federation in Canada
Mm.
in 1867, which not coincidentally was the year of Confederation, and not
Mhm.
coincidental to him. His constant was opposition to the English-speaking and owning elite of Montreal, but he sort of shifted his politics over a life, uh, moving from kind of a liberal to very clearly a social democrat. And then he has this other interesting link that his father had been part of the 1837 rebellions, one of the patriots, and the calls that he was making very much fit into what the Parti Québécois started to say strongly in the 1960s about being, maître chez nous, masters of our own house. So kind of an interesting thematic um, position uh, for you to trace back and say, well, this is the first guy who really started talking about politics, labor, and it all wraps around, in his case, Quebec identity.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, what's interesting about Langto is he establishes a tradition within Quebec social democracy of being very separate
Yeah.
from English Canadian social democracy.
Mm,
And so they're really, it's really like twins separated at birth, despite the fact that the values are quite similar, of Langto and his English Canadian, counterparts. They just don't cooperate. And part of that's linguistic, but it's also
mm,
because he's very much a strong kind of like, French Canadian nationalist. Now, what's interesting is this sort of separation of English Canadian social democracy and Quebecois social democracy lasts all the way up until the Parti Québécois and the Quiet Revolution, but all the way almost up until today, really. I mean, I was
Mhm.
struck by kind of what happened with Alexandre Boulris,
mm,
who, jumped ship over to the Quebec Solidaire, which is a sovereignist party. And little known fact about Langto, he was actually a sovereignist as well. He called for, the creation of a separate Quebec state that was not in Canadian Confederation back in
mm.
1867. So you have stuff that Boulris is saying in 2026 is not all that different than what Langto was saying in 1867, and really shows you, I think, a crucial divide between English Canadian social democracy and Quebec social democracy that really, in a lot of ways, I don't think is healed,
Mhm.
all the way until today.
Mhm.
Well, that's interesting. Thanks for bringing that current parallel as we talk recent news here too. So in your podcast, you also talk about how Longto brought focus to the Montreal elite's control over prices and rents, and so that idea of marketplaces dominated by an extractive and in some ways foreign elite also driving into the farm movement and forming governments there in Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba in 1919, 1921, and 1922 with some help of the smaller labor parties. So the farm movement and government create some solutions to bring more market power to them, a slightly different take on that being control of our own destiny concept. How do they try to rewire Canada?
Well, what's interesting about that too, and again, there's some parallels to today, is that what really these farmer movements are about, particularly on the prairies, is a form of left-wing Western alienation.
Mm,
They are very clear that the exploiters aren't necessarily just the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie located in Montreal and Toronto, and
right.
so they create a regionalization within English Canadian social democracy itself, and they really rally against the big business interests of what they called Eastern Canada. And again, the parallel is actually there till today.
Mm,
You still, I think, see some of those differences of opinion in Western Canada
yeah.
compared to Eastern Canada. We have a possibly an Alberta referendum going on here. And how does the federal NDP relate to a Alberta referendum? And particularly when there's some tensions, as you both know, between the
Hmm.
two of the prairie sections and the federal NDP. So, in this sense, I think it's fascinating to see that this regionalization takes place within English Canada as well, and it's something I think that again kind of lasts till today.
Mhm. Yeah, and but these farm governments they kind of reorganize the economy a little bit
Mm,
to give themselves a better deal, more power, restructure
mm,
to some extent. And so, what in what way do you think maybe these movements that we're seeing, in both the farm movements in Western Canada and the working class but separatist movement that we're seeing in Quebec back in the late 1800s into the early part of the 20th century, kind of reflect, I guess maybe a natural tendency that was set up at the beginning of this country in early colonization. They're
mm,
trying to reset an economy that was built around um, an old colonial elite in Montreal and Toronto, York, um,
mm.
and the people, their successors, who were really kind of still with it, with us. So, do you think that once they're democratizing forces, but maybe also modernizing forces?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're talking about the modernization of Canada in a lot of ways. But what's interesting about it is that it's not kind of a straightforward class analysis, right? It's
Hmm.
not sort of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, as you would see, in places like Europe during this time period by social democratic parties and socialist parties. And so already at a very early stage within Canadian social democracy, you do have this kind of economic populism, but it's regionally based,
Hmm.
and that creates, I think, some interesting types of challenges for social democracy in Canada, because it's always social democracy in Canada always gets cut across by these geographical or regional or
Yeah.
linguistic or religious lines. And again, yeah, it's sort of like I keep on coming back. It's kind of Back to the Future. We're sort of
Right.
having a similar problem right now, and I think
Yeah.
about Avi Lewis and how Avi Lewis is trying to is challenged, I think, in a lot of ways by these same. I think he wants
Hmm.
to have economic populist message, but he's challenged by the same sort of geographical
Yeah.
and indeed linguistic cleavages that exist in Canada in 2026.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite and key storylines here in the farmers movement is also the women leaders. You tell a story of Frances Marion Beynon and Agnes McPhail, the women who really challenged their movement for inclusion in the early 1900s, change it and change the country, arguably. Can you trace their histories for us a bit?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess what's fascinating about farm women is that, and a lot of people I don't think recognize this, is how important they were to the farms.
Hmm.
It was
Yeah.
well documented at the time that if you were just a single man, you could not be a successful farmer. It was absolutely impossible. You absolutely needed the labor, the unpaid labor of
Yeah.
women in order to run a farm effectively. And so these women, doing all this work on the farm, 12, 14 hours a day, and essentially, at the end of it, they got what? Unpaid labor. But also, if there
Yeah.
was a farm that, their husband died, the property passed not to them, despite the
Hmm.
fact they built up the farm, but to their sons or even a
Right.
distant male, yeah, crazy male relative. Like, how unfair is that? So you see a lot of the early, the most kind of radical social democratic feminists in Canada coming out of the prairie farm movements
Yeah,
and
makes sense.
and
Yeah.
and and really decrying this type of exploitation of women. And this goes to something that I kind of a running theme within the podcast is the impact on Canadian history of social democracy. I mean, obviously, liberalism
Hmm.
and conservatism is important for understanding Canadian history. I'm not going to deny that, but so is social democracy. And you can see here that the early feminist movements and early women movements were driven by social democrats, particularly
Hmm.
on the prairies. And so some of the, hopefully a lot, or even maybe a lion's share of the gains made by women in Canadian history in this early time period were driven by social democrats.
Hmm.
And that's something I think the social democratic movement in Canada can be rightly proud of.
Mm. Yeah, Agnes MacPhail was from Ontario. A farm
Mm,
in Ontario, was elected as an MP,
mm,
then came back as a MPP at some point in Ontario, and
mm,
played an important role in the farm movement. Uh, because she got the what was then the the UFO. I love that. The United Farmers of Ontario, which did form that brief government in 1919 to 1922 or three or something, got them to affiliate to the CCF when it was formed in 1932. So it becomes like we have labor affiliates now, but in my
yeah,
I've never heard of that before. So she
mm,
got them to affiliate, and it was a strong piece in the beginning, but then they
mhm,
withdrew within a couple of years. So one of the
mm,
interesting. So tell us a little about So we've got Quebec identity getting bound up with working class movements. We've got agricultural movements. We've got uh, agricultural farm
mm,
movements. But that doesn't play into the Ontario situation much. It kind of gets pushed, it falls beside, as it
mm,
never did in the West. And also in BC.
mm,
Never much of a farm movement to propel the movement. It became
mm,
more of a labor
yeah,
orientation. So just give us a little idea how the kind of the difference in the actual
mhm,
basis of those parties
mhm.
made for different leaders and different orientations in the CCF and NDP.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I could talk a long time. I won't, but about the founding of the CCF,
Yeah.
particularly in 19, there's about three different types of three different meetings in the early 30s, culminating in the 1933 meeting in Regina. But I think what's important to understand about the 1933 meeting in Regina when the CCF gets together is that these people aren't long lost friends. They're actually kind of
Yeah.
suspicious of each other.
Hmm.
You have, the number one, you have nobody from Atlantic Canada. You have
Right.
nobody from Francophone Quebec. You have some unionists from Ontario and some farmers from Ontario and some prairie farmers. You have some feminists. You have what's called social gospelers, which were Protestant
Hmm.
ministers.
Mhm.
And then you got a bunch of Marxists coming out from BC where Nikki is. And so you,
Still like it out here.
so,
Yeah.
And they like
so
the weather's nice.
so yeah, so
We
you
all
have
like it.
this motley crew, if I can use that term, of all these people, and it's only under the pressure of the Great Depression, where you really have to do something because people are literally starving in the streets, that
Yeah.
they all sort of come together.
Mm.
So the two things to note there, obviously, is that Quebec's completely absent, and actually the CCF gets condemned straight away in Quebec, right away, by the clergy and actually not only
Right.
by clergy but other kind of left wing forces
Hmm.
and unions. But already at that very early stage, it's an uneasy alliance between kind of farmers that are a bit more liberal, kind of left wing liberal, unionists from Ontario that are kind of middle of the road, social democratic, but more kind of Fabian, if I could use that term, and
Mhm.
some of the more radicals from the West Coast there. And so these divisions are present in the party, and hence the whole term. It's something small, but it was really big at the time. Was that they call it the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation?
Hmm.
It was
Hmm.
actually not called
Yeah.
a party; it was actually a federation.
Interesting.
And
Federation.
so
Yeah.
you have these sort of ideological divides between radicals and moderates in different occupations straight away, quite early in Canadian history. And again, I think
Mm.
that shapes then the CCF into the NDP and what happens even again until today.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see origins and then as you say, some of the threads still stand in our geographic differences. Okay, so I don't think you're allowed to be a New Democrat unless you know that Tommy Douglas became Saskatchewan premier in 1944, or at least have a sense of that. So, in phases over the next 2 decades, that government created universal health care and pulled other provinces along. So, still a lot of pride there in those origins. But also, for the first time, the CCF's in the driver's seat on economic development. So, at the heart of Tommy Douglas's plans are the crowns, and that's an approach that probably hits a high note with Alan Blakely's 1970s NDP and the Sask Corporation. How does this crown development model address the story of extraction and development independence that we've been tracking?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea, and I don't think this idea is around as much anymore, was that if we were going to develop Canada's resources for the good of all Canadians, they should be publicly owned. Because after
Hmm.
all, who else is going to really develop them for the common good? And particularly, we should not let them be owned by big American resource
Right.
companies. So the crowns, in terms of that's a bit later on in the story, I guess. The crowns in terms of sort of resource development, which is never, outside of Saskatchewan, never really actually catches on. Actually catches on
Hmm.
a little bit in Quebec, actually, with the Prix Québécois and asbestos. But nonetheless, there's kind of two sorts of crowns that sort of start out during this time period. The first crown is, like I said, this kind of natural resource extraction
Hmm.
crowns, which don't really catch on in a big way. But the more enduring crowns are the public utilities,
Right.
telephones, which again is only one left now, one nationally, I guess provincially owned
Mhm.
telecom. But the things like
Yeah.
nationalization of electricity and other public utilities, and again, and the reason why you have that is because these public utilities do a couple things. Number one, they provide a crucial service that people need at a reasonable cost because the government owns them and not trying to make a profit. But also,
Hmm.
they are very important for pushing these services out into these remote areas where it was simply not profitable for a private company to
Right.
establish phone lines or electricity lines, stuff like that. So this is a tradition, I think, that gets established within
Hmm.
Canadian social democracy, both in Quebec and actually in English Canada, and is something I think
Yeah.
that we sort of bequeath to the rest of Canada in terms of the importance of public ownership. And again, drawing more parallels, it appears possibly we have the privatization of airports on the agenda
Yeah.
all of a
Yeah.
sudden here.
Yeah.
So this is, yeah, and this is something where social democrats are able to have a big impact on Canadian history historically, but also even today, standing up and saying, "Hey, this is not a great idea to privatize airports."
Mm.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think
So
we've had different threads on the show about just the impact of privatization on crowns in like, across a series of provinces in the country right now that people are dealing with.
Mm.
So, ongoing impact there of adjusting the model into privatization.
yeah, and in Saskatchewan, even though you've had a conservative government for
Mhm.
15 years ish now, I guess, or maybe
A bit more,
17.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
A bit more.
You still got SaskTel is a crown,
Mhm.
right? Is Crown Corporation. Sask Energy, which delivers natural gas to people's houses. Yes. Um,
Mhm.
Sask Oil still exists.
No, no, no.
It's gone.
The
Okay.
Conservatives got rid of that.
Right.
Devine
And the
got
bus
rid of that in the
and
80s.
this and the Sask bus line got also
Well,
cut
they got
way
rid of
down.
that too, the Conservatives.
But these
Yeah.
are all really interesting that, there's this fairly large crown sector in the
Mhm.
province. But the case that I always find most compelling and interesting is this thing that Blakeney did with potash.
Mhm.
Saskatchewan has, I don't know, whatever massive amount of the global share of potash under its underground. And he had a really bright idea about how to capture that and make it into a resource for the province. Can you just
Mhm.
detail that a little bit?
Yeah.
That story?
So just a bit more broadly before I get into the potash
Yeah.
thing is that one of the most interesting things when you look back at Canadian social democratic history is that there's sort of three things that has really changed massively. The way social democrats view race is completely different. The way social
Mhm.
democrats view gender is completely different. But what maybe, and
Yeah.
that could be respected, right? Is because things have changed in society. But what maybe gets underplayed a bit is how public ownership completely falls off of the radar of social democrats really from the 1990s onwards. I mean,
Yes.
nobody's talking about nationalization and from the 1990s onwards, not just liberals and conservatives, but social democrats either,
Mm.
right? And so, things like Avi Lewis talking about the public ownership of grocery
Yeah.
stores, for instance, is actually kind of an
Mm.
interesting throwback to the way social democrats used to think about things. And so you see, like the potash was a great example of how the Blakeney government nationalized potash, partly because there was some problems with actually, it was actually kind of Russian the nation involved a bit because the federal government was taxing the potash so heavily that the people of Saskatchewan and the provincial government weren't getting any rents from it.
Mm.
But the bigger point was that the potash was the idea of like, we will nationalize this natural resource, and the benefits of its extraction are going to go straight to the people of Saskatchewan.
Mm.
And that's how we're going to more fairly share the wealth of our resources. And now it's just almost unheard of in Canada
Yeah.
for anybody to say, hey, let's nationalize natural resources, right? That's just not even, we can nationalize a pipeline for some weird
I was gonna
reason
say
when
we buy a pipeline.
a pipeline when the but for the weird reason that like we didn't really want to, we were forced to because
Yeah.
the private sector didn't want to do it, and so that's why the liberals ended up doing it. But the whole discourse around public ownership, I personally think would be interesting to reinvigorate a
Mm.
little bit, and talk about more. We don't have to nationalize everything, but we can nationalize the odd thing here and there. And
Yeah.
I'm critical of Lewis in a lot of ways, but the grocery store thing is kind of intriguing. I think that's an interesting thing, a conversation starter anyway.
Mhm.
Especially in the context of all the work provinces and the feds are trying to do on things like major projects, like BC added another 17, 18 major
Mhm,
projects to their list this week, right? Like it's
mhm,
looking at that context on this old model about natural resources
mhm,
and so the new model we haven't seen decision makers I think lean into a new
mhm,
model in response to the US administration changes as we pivoted so
mhm,
heavily into that natural resources as the nation building projects.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We could use public ownership to nation build,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
province build, by the way, both
Yeah.
of them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we could use that, and we that's just not a tool that's in the toolboxes anymore
Yeah, totally.
of provincial governments or federal governments, and I can guarantee you that the older social democrats back, in the CCF days or the early days of the NDP would be rolling in their graves if they what you've given up on public ownership.
This is
That's
right.
what defined us as
Yeah,
social democrats.
Yeah. It
yeah,
was seen as a kind of a fundamental tool of development, and
Mhm.
now SAS potash is being privatized. It's called
Yeah. Mhm.
uh,
oh,
Nutrient, yeah.
right, yeah. Right, right.
nutrient.
Nutrient, yeah.
Okay, still based in Regina, though, right?
Mhm.
And I believe.
And Chicago.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, okay.
And
There you see.
Chicago,
This is what
yes.
starts to happen, right?
I was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, now I know which one we're talking
But
about. It was the
Yeah,
now,
BC ripples."
yeah. But one of the other things I certainly recall from the Romano era, for example, was that the crowns um, played not only an important role in keeping prices down, but they paid a dividend to the province to help pay for healthcare and education and keep taxes low.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a lot of different
Yeah.
ways you could spin that story for those who
Mhm.
don't like paying taxes, which is kind of a constituency of the right or has become that. There
Mhm.
was a story to tell then
Yeah.
that this is, in
Yeah,
fact,
even
like
around
this.
affordability. Like, affordability
Yeah.
is the issue of our times. How do
Yeah,
you increase affordability? Well, you have very, decent prices when it comes to basic things like electricity and telephones,
Yeah.
water and things that people need. So, the
right.
affordability piece, and that was really a huge one back in the day. It
It,
was the affordability
Mhm.
piece.
it was, here in Ontario, the slogan of the formation of Ontario Hydro was power at cost.
Yeah,
That
there you
Yeah.
was
go.
the idea. It's like we need cheap power to keep the lights on and
Mhm.
make our factories run.
Yeah,
Um,
and the CCF pushing that in the
yes,
legislature in
they
Ontario,
were.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
There was a large CCF contingent under Jolliffe in that legislature. So the story of, provincial CCFs and provincial NDPs maybe hasn't been as well told,
Mhm.
and that's why sometimes I get rankled a little bit. It was like, oh, the NDP does social democracy NDP. They don't matter anymore because they only have 5 seats House of Commons. Like,
Yeah.
well, historically speaking, some of the most important things that social democrats have done have been at the
Yeah.
provincial level. So
Yeah.
let's not forget that piece. And I think it's unfortunate when particularly the national media sort of yell out, oh,
Right.
social democracy is dead because you only have 5 MPs or
Yeah.
6 MPs. Well,
Two.
social democracy is way bigger than just
Yeah.
the federal NDP or the federal CCF used to be.
Yeah. Two
Mhm.
premiers and 5 official opposition leaders. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's actually more MLAs, MPPs, MHAs, and all those for the New Democrats than Liberals by far in this
Yes.
country. So a very
Tom's
significant
doing math. Huh?
provincial,
We gotta get into that one soon.
yeah, very strong provincial presence, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's made an important contribution to the entire country. But let's take us into kind of the what ifs a little
Mm,
bit. You can certainly argue that in a country with the geography of Canada, social democratic movements that push aside elites and try and bring
mm,
power closer to themselves, cut themselves a better deal, but also are interested in cooperation on national projects where they can. Although, as we've said, difficult because there's kind of different bases. We have language, we have
mm,
religion that has divided people. But give me your thoughts about what if the CCF and NDP didn't exist,
okay.
provincially or federally. What kind of country do you think this would be? How would it be different?
Well, I think we'd look a lot more like the United States, essentially,
Hmm.
right? We'd be the 51st state in all but name
Well,
if we didn't have social democracy, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
So what
You're
social democracy?
welcome, everybody.
Yeah,
Here.
exactly. You don't know this. But, like, so think of all the things that social democrats have done that have differentiated us from the United States, right? We've all touched a
mhm,
lot of them: public ownership, social programs. I would argue a different view of multiculturalism, even, and
Yeah.
ethnic and racial diversity, women's movement. So all these things you see are like, yeah, I mean, really, what do social democrats do over history? Well, they make us into being a country that's a lot more collectivist and
Mhm.
less individualist than the United States, and also I think a country that's a lot more cooperative. Like I think we have and
Mhm.
hence the whole name talk today about the cooperative Commonwealth Federation. We do have a sense of more cooperation here than the United States, where it's sort of every person for themselves. So I think that you would have a Canada that looks almost indistinguishable from the United States politically and maybe even culturally without social democrats there.
Yeah.
So that's a big accomplishment that social democrats, both at the federal provincial level and within Quebec as well,
mhm.
can be rightly proud of.
Dave, thanks so much for this great historical tour of the social
Mm.
democratic movement. I think it's sort of needed more than ever right now. And congrats on your podcast. We're looking
Yeah.
forward to the next episode. So we're going to take a quick break and be right back with Tom and I giving some big love or maybe a big heave to a couple of stories from the week. Before we wrap up today's show, we've come to the part that we like to call Love It or Heave It, about something one of us would like to keep or one of us would like to get rid of. So love it or heave it and forever forget it. What do you got this week, Tom?
Well, I'm really heeding this idea from Mark Carney about selling off our ports and airports, and these are critical pieces of infrastructure, and importantly, they are monopolies. Here in the Toronto area, a PC government 26 years ago sold Highway 407 for $1 billion.
Yeah.
Uh, and last year, Ferrovial, a Madrid-based global investment fund, bought just a 5% share of that company, of that highway, for $2 billion. 5%, $2 billion. So that makes the total value of the company, market value, of $40 billion. So what that tells me is that somehow this asset increased by 3,900% in 25 years.
Well,
I think we would all like to see that in our
yeah.
pension
I
funds,
mean, good
but
returns.
it ain't happening for me. But the road hasn't changed. It's not bigger or better. It's not worth that much because of anything that's being improved. It's worth that much because that is the price that will be paid to buy a profit stream
Mm,
that is that lucrative. And we pay
mhm.
for it. People in this part of the world, in the GTA, certainly are familiar with with the highway and how expensive it is. Thatcher kicked all this stuff off a long time ago. In 1987, she privatized London Heathrow. Today, those shares are owned by just 6 entities: the Qatari monarchy,
Yeah.
the Saudi monarchy, the Chinese
Oh, wow.
government, the Singapore Wealth Fund, an Australian pension fund, and Ardain, a big French investment firm. Heathrow's 2024 annual report showed revenue of 3.6 billion pounds, 917 million of which, 25% of it, went to profit, went to those
Okay.
6 investors as profit. That's a 25% skim that is paid for by the traveling public
Okay.
in the price of airfare tickets. So why does everything feel so expensive? Well, part of it is politicians handing over monopolies like airports to private capital. And even as he said last week that his focus is on affordability, um, that is what Mark Carney seems to be planning to do.
Hmm. Interesting, especially in the context of the conversation we had with Dave McGrane about nationalization. So,
Yeah.
and new models. This sort of seems like an old idea coming back up again. It didn't work or didn't float the first time.
Yeah. Well, all right. We did, fight it off. It was pushed off, whatever, 10 years ago, I guess now.
Yeah,
But these ideas, they keep coming back.
yeah.
Um, what about you? What are you loving or heaving?
This is the part where we see if my friends actually listen to the show.
Okay.
Because anyone who knows me well will laugh that my love this week is, 'cause given that I'm not a sports person,
Right.
that we had this spring federal economic statement and we saw a lift from sports from the Carney government. So why does someone like me who categorizes all sporting games as sports ball care? Well, just because my own preferences are sort of punishing myself with gym challenges, it doesn't mean I wouldn't appreciate the attempt to infuse community building elements of sports with these investments. And I think there's been an interesting fallout to sort of watch people think about why sports investments are so critical right
Yeah.
now. And I really lean into not only, we are seeing some of those investments needing to go to these big ticket items, like reasons I'll be avoiding downtown Vancouver in most of June and July, like
Yeah.
FIFA, because of the chaos that's heading our way, and that's needed there. But others for national sports organizations who have been asking for funds, have been underfunded for a long time, and really identifying here the needs to target participation around children
Yeah.
and youth,
Mhm.
particularly underrepresented communities. And then safe sports systems. So I think we have all seen these big headline, horrifying stories
Yeah.
about harassment,
Yes.
sexual harassment, physical harassment within
Mhm.
sports in the public domain. And now some of this money is to help support some of those safety measures. But also, I think there's a really critical community building element that we are missing. And I think we're still
Yeah.
missing it from the pandemic, where when we
Mhm.
think about in our local communities and what these sports organizations offer in terms of team building and health and but social connection as well, which I think, as we see sort of that rise of the disconnect of the public from each other as we talk through complicated issues, I think that really some of the intent here is the social infrastructure aspects of sports funding and bringing back where
Yeah.
there's been defunding that I think there's some real ramifications. So for all you
Um,
actual sports fans, we're not
uh,
me. That is
mm,
good for building our competitive spirit for sure and world stage status. But I think there's some other underlying elements we saw in this announcement from the feds and its inclusion of sports that do speak to what we're trying to do and different type of nation building approach.
that's interesting. Yeah, and in a time when we're concerned about teenagers and young adults scrolling so much,
Yeah.
and the impact of that, having amateur sports, soccer, go play baseball for a while, whatever, just that culture.
Yeah.
Ah,
Inclusively
yeah,
welcome some of those people who are not being represented in sport. Yeah.
yeah, it's a very progressive
Novel
idea.
idea.
Yeah. Well, that's our show for this week. But we're going to be back next Monday with Josh Bijak. He's the executive director of the Douglas Caldwell Leighton Foundation. He's going to tell us a little bit about um, some of the work that his organization is doing across the country. And I think it'll be an interesting talk that, in a way, connects with what Dave McGrane talked about today,
Yeah.
because he'll talk about kind of the different different approaches to social democracy in different parts of this country. So we'll see you next week, Nikki. Have a great week.
Sounds great. Have a great weekend.
All right. See ya.
Thanks for joining Left East to West with hosts Nikki Hill and Tom Parkin. We love to hear your comments, ratings, follows, and shares. It helps people find us. To become a Left East to West community member and to help us reach even more Canadians, subscribe using the link in the show notes. You can watch us on YouTube or listen wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Just search for Left East to West and subscribe. I'm Doug Hamilton signing off for Left East to West. We'll see you next week.